Here we go. Okay, we are live. Welcome to our weekly basic income discussion group. I'm Alex Howlett. I host these things. Today we're talking about Douglas Rushkoff, who is a former basic income proponent who has now changed his mind and is against basic income. So we have a 5-minute video to watch where he makes his case, and we're going to watch it as a group and pause it as we go to talk about his criticisms. But before we get started on the video, I guess the question I want to ask is: has everyone watched the video?
No.
No. Okay. So the question I want to ask is: what kinds of things would change your mind about basic income? What kinds of things, if you found out about them, would make you think twice? Would shift you to maybe being more skeptical of basic income, or even more supportive of basic income if you are coming into this as a basic income skeptic? So that's the starting question. Bethany.
It's a good question. I feel like catastrophic unintended consequences, but the tricky thing is, like, I don't know what those are. But if I learned, like, through the complexity of this big change to the economy, actually there's this side effect that you weren't really anticipating, but it's going to be really problematic. Whatever that side effect might be, then I would definitely think twice, because it is a huge change to a lot of different things. So it doesn't seem outside of the realm of possibility that there's some unintended consequence that I'm not considering. But
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Also, if it turns out that all the psychology that we've been looking at that supports the idea that people would thrive is proven to be wrong on a large scale, and then we have more kind of homelessness and more of the stuff that we're trying to stop, because people take it as a cushion when it's not enough. And so they're making decisions based on, because I've done that. I think I have more money. I think I have enough. And so I'm just going to do this anyway because I want to. So they might kind of go willy-nilly and think, I can buy this, I can do this, and get more in debt. Yeah.
Okay, Richard.
Well, maybe it was last month, I think it was, I watched a video on Kuwait by, I believe it's a Kuwaiti news agency or something like that, and they showed all these people who, they were wealthy because of the oil money, and they completely lost all sense of well-being, connectedness to society and whatnot. And so there was this agency that was set up by the government, and they went to these poor communities, and they fixed up their homes and things like that, so that they had them work in fast food, and so they would appreciate their money and things like that, and it just seems so weird. So if somehow, for some reason, the Americans needed that because the basic income became high enough, then that would be a thing that I would become skeptical about it. And if I was against basic income and I wanted to become, if some information I wanted to become for it, then seeing all the benefits that would come from it, like the health benefits and the lower recidivism rates and things like that.
Okay. Cool. Steve.
Well, it turned out that, particularly in America, if poor people's problem was more social or cultural than it was just material or fiscal. Particularly in America, because in America, of course, people still aren't living on just $1 a day, and they don't have 20% infant mortality, and they're worried about malaria and stuff like that. If it turned out that the obstacles were social, then that would change my mind.
Cool. Yeah, and Rick on the live stream says, I am coming in as a skeptic, and what would make me support it would be a compelling discussion on how it would increase the well-being of the poor rather than maintain business as usual. And Mitchell has a comment about universal basic assets, which are something that Douglas Rushkoff will bring up as we're watching the video. So we'll get to that comment when that part of the video comes up. So for me, unsurprisingly, nothing is going to get me to change my mind. I can't, let me put it this way. I can't think of anything that would change my mind about basic income. But a lot of the issues that you guys brought up, I think are important issues. And then for me, it's the question of, like if people don't work, then, when you give them basic income, then maybe the amount of basic income we can afford is lower, right? It's all a matter of degree. Maybe the level of basic income is different, but, I still think about it as this fundamental thing. The economy is not going to function unless consumers have spending money. So even if poverty is primarily a social problem, I would say, okay, that's an issue that's not going to be fixed by basic income, but it doesn't mean that we don't still need a mechanism for getting people spending money. And an efficient labor market doesn't naturally do that. So I kind of still come back to, well, you still need a basic income. It's just there are other problems that basic income doesn't solve. So I think that's it for me. Does anyone else have any comments before we get into the video?
No, I guess just at some point we might get to talk a little bit more about whether Douglas has a different plan, or he kind of seemed to allude to certain things, but I wasn't sure if he had put forth like a comprehensive alternative that he was in favor of.
Right.
So I guess maybe when he starts talking about some of the alternatives, like what Mitchell brought up, then we can.
Yeah, and then a question we can ask as we're watching this is, what problem did he imagine that basic income was supposed to solve?
Right.
That then he started to say, well, maybe it doesn't solve this problem.
That's a really great point, because that does seem from the video like maybe he was thinking of a different problem from you, and so like that's why maybe it isn't so good for solving that problem, like inequality, for example, which we've talked about in here before. Or certain kinds of it, that kind of thing. Yeah, we can get into the video.
So Rick says, it sounds like you are saying the government needs to bail out corporations to save the economy. Why can't businesses fail and prices go up and people consume less? So there's a few different questions here. So I'm not saying that the government needs to bail out corporations. I'm saying that there needs to be a mechanism to get spending money to people, because the economy is not going to produce what people don't have the money to buy. So we kind of have this expectation that the labor market is going to be this mechanism, but there's kind of no law of economics that says jobs will somehow provide people with incomes at the optimal level that they can get the most benefit from the economy. There might be cases where it makes sense for the government to bail out corporations if those corporations are doing things that really benefit consumers and that kind of thing. But that's not really the point I was getting at. In terms of why not let prices go up, I would say that generally speaking, I don't think it's a good idea to let prices go up or down too much, because you kind of want a stable currency so that people can set prices reliably and consistently. So rather than let prices go up, if we need to admit that we're poorer and we're not going to be able to produce as much for people, that means making it so that people have less money to spend, rather than letting the prices go up. And the same thing in the other direction. Instead of letting prices go down, we can give people more money to spend. And we can use basic income as part of that equation. So as the economy is able to produce more and more, or sustainably produce more and more, then that means we can make sure that people have more money to spend to get the full benefit from that. And we can use basic income to do that. Okay, so let's start the video. Let's see if the sound works on this. So to introduce the video, at the beginning he actually kind of talks about why he was for basic income. So we might not need to pause it during that part, because he's kind of making a lot of arguments that I think I would agree with. But if anyone wants to pause the video at any point, just let me know, like, can you pause it here, and then we'll pause and discuss. Otherwise, I'll just pause it when I want to pause it. does not appear to be playing sound. Oh,
You know,
that's
it's quite the clickbaity title again, like I was complaining about. last
yeah, the
week.
colossal problem with universal
He
basic
doesn't
income.
really give a colossal problem, in my opinion, but that's getting ahead of myself.
Yeah, so here we go.
He gives like several things against
No,
it.
I said unmute. Really? It's still muted. Oh, is that because it's muted? Sorry guys, technical difficulties. Is that because it's muted here? Does not appear to be.
Yep.
Okay, so that works. But now we've paused that, and now maybe that means we can play this.
Yeah.
For a long time, I was a fan of universal basic income. And the logic I had was that, I always hear politicians talking about, let's create jobs for people. That's what we need is jobs, more jobs. And as if that's what's going to solve the economic problem. So the government is supposed to lend money to a bank who can then lend money to a corporation who will then build a factory in order for people to have jobs. Do we really need more jobs? In California, they're tearing down houses as we speak because the houses are in foreclosure and they want to keep market values high. The U.S. Department of Agriculture burns food every week in order to keep the prices of that food high, even though there's people who are starving and people who need homes. We can't just let people have those homes. Why? Because they don't have jobs. So now we're supposed to create jobs for people to make useless stuff for other people to buy, plastic crap that we're going to throw away or stick in storage units or end up in landfill, just so those people can have jobs so that we can justify letting them participate in the abundance. And that's kind of ass backwards. So I thought, well, shoot, rather than creating useless jobs, what if we just let people have the stuff that's in abundance? Just let people have the houses. What's the problem with this? And UBI kind of goes along that lines of, well, if we have more than enough stuff, if we don't need everybody working all the time, then why don't we just let people have income, or at least go to a 4-day work week, or a 3-day work week, or a 2-day work week? Or if work is the thing that's scarce, then why don't we meet that out?
So I just want to point out the 4-day work week, 3-day work week, 2-day work week. That's not really compatible with an efficient labor market. Like putting those restrictions on what jobs are. Like some jobs, it might make sense to have a 2-day work week or something like that. But for certain things, it would be really inefficient to hire 3 different people working 2 days instead of one person working 6 days or something like that.
Like things that require specialized training or have like a lot of returns to kind of getting in the groove of them or these kinds of things.
Yeah.
But they actually found an issue with that in Sweden a few years ago. There was a pilot about that, and
Of shortening the work week.
For like a nursing home or something like that.
Not that bad.
So for just one business, they tried it. Okay, and it ended up being less effective in terms of
and really expensive.
Yeah, I mean, like training, 3 times as many doctors or something like that, just so they can work 2 days a week doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, the upside of it is I think it can be really good for quality of life of the people working to like have a life and also like the job that maybe they enjoy but don't want to do like 90 hours a week.
Right.
So there is kind of like always a tension there for me between like the efficient, like what's efficient and what's good for that, like the quality of life of the people. I mean, you and I have debated this a little bit, like in terms of norms in different countries are different already, like within certain industries, like in academia, the norm of how many hours you work is really different in Europe versus in the US, and the quality of life is kind of different too. So,
Yeah. Like if you want to do a specific job, but the norm is that you're working 80, 100-hour weeks in that job, then that's not going to be available to you.
So this is the conundrum of, my particular niche of the world. Like the people that I know, the different options that I've had, like that's usually like a big part of the trade-off that people are facing is like really poor quality of life outside of their job but doing an interesting job that they like or like and so it's kind of unfortunate that people face that trade-off in that niche.
And also in the corporate world when I was there, anybody who went part-time, it was never part-time because you're doing a job that everybody else is required to work 8 hours, so you're actually continuing to work and trying to cram those hours in off site
Right.
or wherever.
Right,
And
right.
everybody complained about that. They were on the record as part-time.
Right.
And that happened with Ian too.
Oh,
You're not,
really?
Yeah, you're not really part-time.
That's
It's just
interesting.
on paper.
Mhm, mhm.
And so now you're not getting paid for the extra
Right.
work that you're doing.
Right, right,
So
right.
Really, and you can't really relax in that
Yeah.
situation because other people too are getting ahead
Exactly.
because they're taking all those hours
Yeah,
and
yeah.
being visible.
Yeah, exactly. On the flip side, and not to belabor this point like too much, but like the norm of a 40-hour work week can be inefficient in the other direction. Like a lot of people just sit around.
Oh yeah,
And they're, like we were talking about
Absolutely.
this with Elizabeth, like from working from home and stuff. A lot of people just like are forced to go in and like sit around for 8 hours,
Yes.
whether or not there's anything for them
Yeah,
to do.
I've been there.
You know,
Yeah.
so that's also kind of
Yeah.
stupid. Like sometimes you
Right.
don't need the people working the number of hours that they're working.
That
So
has
we
to
do
do with
have
it,
like
yeah.
an inefficient convention.
It's a lack
now,
of
too.
attention and this fluctuation in companies about when
Right.
there are busy times,
Yeah,
when you're
exactly.
building something, when you're not building something.
Exactly.
It's too
Yeah.
hard for them to calibrate, when
Yeah, it
people
is.
should be there and not
And they
be there.
want
Should just
people
all be
around.
there.
And
Yeah,
so they
all be
can
there.
be ready and available. And
Yes.
stuff, I guess. I haven't really worked in
Actually, in
companies,
Europe, there in England, in Europe, there's a just in time. What do you call it? Just in time. We like call someone in,
Mhm.
and they come just in time for the the rush hour thing, and then they just
Right.
kick them out immediately after that.
Yeah. And they do that in retail all the time, right? They hire people for the Christmas rush
Right.
and things like that. But
Yeah.
that's
No, but that's just during a single day.
during one day.
Right,
Wow.
right.
Okay.
And I guess like there's some moves in this direction among certain fields where you can like mostly work from home or
Right,
like
yes.
Skype in
Yeah.
and like you don't really have to be like sitting there doing
Right.
nothing or
Right.
like it would probably be more efficient to have different norms like maybe 20 hours that everybody's physically there and you just stick your meetings at those times and then
Right.
Right.
And there's
Figuring
also,
things
it's
out.
not a 100% correspondence between what the rules are and what the norms are.
Yeah.
Right.
That's true too.
So
yeah.
in Europe, if you have norms that if you're an academic, you actually only work 40 hours, then it's not like you're pretending to work 40 hours and
Right.
cramming it in other places.
Right.
Because it's actually the cultural norm.
Right.
Exactly, yeah.
yeah.
True.
It's really different.
Yeah,
in
that's
Europe,
true. And if you're in a company where everybody is overworking,
Right,
they're
exactly.
always up there, sleeping there
Yeah,
sometimes.
like
then-
even when they pass the rule. Sorry, I cut you
Yeah.
off.
No, well, then there's a whole different
Mm-hmm.
way of, they can't really measure part-time versus
Right,
full-time,
right,
for example.
exactly.
Everybody's doing it all the time.
Exactly.
Ah,
And
like
like
yeah.
to get ahead, really.
In Japan, there's it's called like karaishi or something like that, where people overwork themselves
Yes,
to
I've
death,
seen that.
and they actually like sleep there and things
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Yeah, and in medicine, they pass certain rules about residence, and the most
Yeah.
elite hospitals don't. Often the norm is not to follow them,
Right.
which is
Yeah,
so
right.
to your point.
Yeah.
And like the
Yeah.
rule is already like 90 hours a week or something.
Yeah.
Like, and then they just work more than that.
Right.
In Japan,
Yeah.
they stay there until the boss leaves. So the
Right.
boss
Right.
stays out all night or something like that. They have to
Right.
stay there, and they have to go to the drinking
Yeah.
parties because it's,
Yeah.
It's not funny.
So I think
don't
there
have to
can
do
be
it
like
anymore.
there can also be some inefficiencies in this. Like as much as there's an efficiency to like let's say you have a highly trained person like having them work a lot, there's also inefficiencies where people are trying to show off to the boss past the point that they're like efficient in their work because
Yeah,
they're just too
yeah.
tired or like
Right.
and they're just making poor decisions, but they're just trying to show that they're a hard worker, stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's
There's
So-
a lot of
nuance to
factors
this,
here.
yeah.
It gets
I know.
it gets really complicated,
Right.
And I think it's hard to kind of like impose structure on the labor market, externally to kind of like try
Right.
to
Yeah.
benefit the workers.
Right.
What we can do, of course, is have a basic income,
Right.
and now you've got kind of a baseline of people have the freedom to spend their time how they want,
Right.
and then you can pay them, and they can spend their time doing the thing you want them to do. And if you want to be an academic, and there's norms for professors to be working, or postdocs to be working 90, 100-hour weeks, but you still want to be an academic, then maybe no one's going to pay you to be in that particular position. But that doesn't mean you can't spend your time doing the same thing that you would have wanted to do anyway.
Yeah, but this
Yeah.
is like not a full solution because like a lot of times there's only certain numbers of people who can have access to like equipment or to patients if you want to be a doctor. Or, like it's not just like everyone can go off on their own. And,
depending on the size of the basic income and the resources in the economy, maybe there are people who don't have access to universities who pool together some money and buy a piece of equipment to share it or something like that. I mean, there's always possibilities.
yeah, I guess I agree that it would help, but I also think
Yeah.
this partly falls under the category you were talking about before, like things that a basic income just doesn't like
Things
completely
what?
solve one. Things that a basic income doesn't completely address
Right,
one way or the
yeah.
other.
Yeah.
It's kind of its own thing, and I think it's probably best dealt with like through norms rather than like rules at the government level, but just sort of
Yeah, and then the question
negotiating
is,
these
how do
norms
you-
and how they work.
But you
Yeah,
can't
how to
really
get the
share
norms.
a radio telescope or something like that. That's costs like millions of dollars.
Yeah, right.
Well, I mean, we do share radio telescopes, right? So
But you can't.
To do research.
yeah,
Or like like the colliders or whatever, like
Yeah.
yeah, particle accelerators.
yeah,
and-
particle accelerator.
Yeah, and we do share those too. But I get your point that it would take a lot of crowdfunding for a bunch of random people to pool together the money to build a particle accelerator.
Or like with
think
what I
that's-
do, like
yeah.
access to teaching some of the like a certain group of students. Like those students are a limited number. Actually, we don't think of it like that, but they are. Like if you really like teaching.
Well, I care about the students the most, right? So I wouldn't want, like my goal in society is not to make sure that you get to teach the
I
best
know, but I
students. It's
wasn't
to make
talking.
sure
I was
that
talking about the other
okay.
aspect of things,
Yeah.
which is like there's this tension, like I said, between quality of life of like people doing these different kinds of professions and what's efficient for the profession. That's not fully addressed by basic income.
Yes, there's certainly things, and this is always going to be true. There are people who would love to be spending their time in a certain way and to be respected as the best in what they do, and it's just not going to happen because they're not the best. Like every basketball player wants to be the best basketball
Or
player
they don't
in
want
the
to
world,
make
right?
like the trade-offs of giving up other things in their lives.
Yeah.
Too, which is
And dedicating
Sure,
different.
Yeah.
but I'm trying to eliminate that and
Right.
just say like there's factors that are outside of anyone's control. Even like not everyone can be LeBron James, right?
Right.
No matter how much they want to be, and you can't like tweak the labor market
Basic income
or
isn't gonna
basketball
make them.
leagues,
No,
to
right. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
agree. I mean, like,
yeah,
I think the norms about how to work like affect more people and they're kind of like a broader, more
Yeah.
fluid question than just the fact that not everyone can be LeBron James. For
Right.
some of the
Actually, in
reasons
the
that we're talking
future,
about,
you
but-
could if you genetically engineer someone.
Oh, now we're going.
Yeah, see, there you
Well,
further.
to be LeBron James is a relative thing, so there's always going to be someone who's the best.
Unless
Yeah,
everyone becomes the same.
Yeah.
If we're in trouble about who to hire in the NBA.
Harrison
But that's
Bergeron.
on-
Do
Or
you
you
know
can
that?
basketball is going to get pretty
Or
boring
you
if
can
everyone's
put
the
someone
same.
in an android body or something like that.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
One question about norms versus rules. So, a 40-hour work week in America, is that a norm or a rule?
It's kind of both.
Yeah.
I think because like it's sort of there are certain kinds of jobs where like it counts as overtime if
Right.
you work and that's some
But
kind
it's sort of the
rule, but-
base. It's what.
But
and
it's
I
also
think
a
that's
norm,
based
yeah.
on farming. I'm not sure, but I know daylight
Yeah.
savings times.
It's not based on farming.
I
It's
think
based
it's
on
all
industrial
based on
revolution.
industrial
yes,
work,
It is.
yeah.
Right.
You're right.
farmers are always exempt from all these labor
Right, you're
regulations.
right,
Like
yeah.
the children are allowed to work on the farm,
Right,
child
right.
labor, and
Yeah,
all
yeah,
that kind of
yeah.
stuff.
So it's like in
Yeah.
the mills and trying to limit the amount of
Yeah.
Right.
labor.
Yeah.
But that's really archaic. I mean, to think about it that way. To
Um,
have that 40 hours for everything. It's
Yeah.
kind of like it's
Well,
a
that's why we
rubber
don't really use it for everything.
I mean,
there's lots of professions where you don't.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, that's true. But in
And-
the office
and then-
world, the corporate world,
Yeah.
that's the norm.
Even back then when they were putting these regulations into place, the question is, what's the problem with our society that the alternative to working at this horrible job is worse than working at this horrible job, right? Like we could have maybe gotten improved. It might not have been 40-hour work week or something like that, but we might have been able to improve the lives of factory workers just by providing them with an outside option, because now the employer has to compete with that. They have to say like,
Oh yeah,
yeah. So I think that's kind of the more organic way to do it, rather than kind of imposing these limitations. Yeah, go ahead.
Again, this is not so specific to basic income, but there are special things about people being coordinated on, like, for example, which day they're going to take off or which days. So there,
Yeah.
like, there is an advantage that sort of it has to do with the group level
Yeah.
to having some of these norms. So
Yeah.
the fact that most people are free on the same 2 days
Yeah,
is
right,
like actually
yeah.
really helps people like coordinate activities, see each
Right,
other.
yeah.
Yeah.
And in France, like we've talked about how they have a different norm where most of the stores are closed on Sunday. So that's a different coordination point where people like really spend time with their families on that day because people aren't
Yeah.
working, even those people aren't working.
Yeah.
So there's different like returns to this kind of thing that's not just addressable the way that you said. That
Right.
requires like a kind of group level norm.
Yeah, so I mean,
Example,
if
the
we
Downton Abbey, what's her name? Maggie Smith, the Dowager. So somebody said, "I'll be back on the weekend," and she said, "What's a weekend?"
Oh yeah, right.
Like, because she doesn't have any sense of working.
yeah, exactly.
So what is
right,
that?
right. Yeah, and the servants get different days off at different times.
They do,
Yeah.
yeah.
But then
Yeah.
they're good to hang out. So.
Right.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and then we could ask the question, like he's suggesting having potentially shorter work weeks. Maybe we could have norms where, you know, if you're working one day, this is the day you're working. If you're working 2
Right.
days, then these are the 2 days,
Yeah.
or something
Right.
like that.
But it would need to be really calibrated, and he's not thinking it through.
Well, that's
really.
the thing. I mean, he's giving a very like cursory,
Very broad.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is not something I would ever suggest, like trying to shorten the work week or something like
Well,
that.
I wonder if he has
Yeah.
thinking behind it, if he's thought through all of what we're talking about when he comes out with these statements. That's my question.
Hmm.
Oh,
Or is
I
it
don't
like-
think he's thought through everything we talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I also think other people have mentioned like, oh, like wouldn't it be nice if instead of like if with automation or like with advances in technology, like we could work fewer hours.
Yes.
That's definitely like
Right.
something people have commented on. Like, why aren't
Yes.
we working fewer hours?
Right. Or
when
working
we-
from
It's
home.
it's a
Yeah.
comment that comes up a lot, but it also it doesn't really make sense, because in an efficient labor market, you'd expect some people would be working a lot and some people wouldn't be working very much or at all, or that kind of thing.
But
You know,
again,
it depends
it's
on the
like
job.
people dream of it. I think because it's like potentially really good for quality of life.
Right.
I think that's why it comes up.
Right, but I think this would be just as good for quality of life. No?
Basic
Yeah,
income?
I mean, but only because of like big picture efficiency returns, which most people aren't factoring in.
Well, because you have your baseline
leverage.
quality of life where you don't have a job, and then anything you're doing on top of that is almost by definition improving your quality of life. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing it.
Right, but like I
Right.
said, you still have the doctor who like would rather get some sleep, but like in order to be a doctor has to work 100 hours a week or whatever.
Yeah, but if that person's choosing to be a doctor, they're still better off being a doctor, right? That's why they chose it.
Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean it's optimal. Well, I don't know. We know we're over
Yeah.
points on this already.
Anyway, so Rick has a couple more points here. So he says that my point seems to depend on the assumption that there is a greater benefit to people on a higher level of consumption. I disagree. Pick an interest, and there's already too much to consume. So I think we're using the word consumption a little bit differently. So for me, when I say consumption, you know, consumers and et cetera, the way I'm defining that is you are receiving a benefit from the economy. That's what consumption is. So if my point depends on the assumption that there's greater benefit to people on a higher level of consumption, that's because I'm defining consumption itself as receiving the benefit. So there's a greater benefit to people receiving a greater benefit. I think that is true. That's kind of like definitional to the term I'm using. And I think you're using the word consumption in a different way, like using up resources perhaps unnecessarily and stuff like that. And that's not generally what we mean when we talk about consumption here. And it's not what economists mean when they talk about consumption either. It's what environmentalists talk about when they talk about consumption, but they're talking about kind of two slightly different things. And sometimes people try to line up, like, you know, a certain amount of economic consumption corresponds to a certain amount of like resource waste or resource using up or something like that. But it kind of in economics, it doesn't actually have to be that way. You can have forms of consumption that don't waste any resources. It's just consumption because people are paying for it and they're getting a lot of benefit, right? So it could be, you know, receiving a massage or you know, taking a yoga class or something like that. So the question is, how do you design benefit? And I would say what you do is you have money. You know, people have money, and that money corresponds to a certain amount of benefit. You spend it, and you receive a certain amount of benefit. Then, independently of that, you can look at the economy and say, well, wait a minute, what resources are we wasting that we kind of want to conserve? And then you can tax that specific resource, and then people will use less of that resource, and maybe they will be consuming in ways that are less wasteful of resources, but still provide a benefit. So it's all about kind of like conserving and optimizing our resource usage while providing people the maximum benefit, so that they get the most out of the economy. And in terms of prices and how we think about money and the value that it buys, usually what we do is actually always what we do is we look at a basket of kind of consumer goods, like the basic things that people spend their money on, things that people need. It could be basic needs or things that people want and stuff like that. And we try to keep those prices stable. So then each dollar of spending corresponds to kind of a certain amount of benefit in the economy. But like I said, you can optimize it so that you're not wasting as many resources. So that's kind of like the distinction I would draw.
And
Yeah.
Mitchell's just saying that the average person is working 47 hours a week according to day.
Yeah.
if you will.
So Dan Schabel says the average worker is working 47 hours. Interesting. So it's interesting because it's the average worker. If you take the average person, then some people don't count as workers, and then the average is going to be a lot lower. Yeah. Right. So then Rick is pointing out UBI does not direct how people use their resources to match my definition of benefit. So that's exactly right. So the money itself, when people get the income, that's flexible. They can spend it on whatever they want. But then if we want to conserve resources in the economy, what we can do is we can tax the use of those specific resources to disincentivize that waste or to disincentivize pollution, that kind of thing. And now, so you're not like messing with people's money or restricting what they can buy on that end, but you're making certain things more expensive, the things that we want people to do less of. So that helps.
Like a carbon tax.
Like a carbon tax, a tax on cigarettes or something like that. These are called Pigovian taxes, and it's all about changing the incentives of what people do in the economy. But yeah, I think keeping the income simple and straightforward, and then making these adjustments in terms of like individual incentives about individual things is a pretty efficient way to go about it. Yeah. Yeah. Back to Douglas Rushkoff.
Good, yeah.
Yeah.
See what he has
All
to
right.
say about some things.
Tear
I would
some
say,
more.
okay, we've got these 10 days that you're allowed to work this year. So come on to the farm and do that work, and then you'll have to find something else for you to do the rest of the time.
So I just want to point out that he's really taken it to the extreme, that we
Right.
have like people who literally work 10 days a year. And maybe that makes sense for certain professions, but
I think he's just giving like a rhetorical strategy more than like actually thinking we would get to 10 days a year.
right. But I guess I'm pointing out that in terms of his conceptualization of his concept of this, he's kind of leaving room for it to go all the way. Like we can go all the way with this kind of strategy of narrowing down the number of days.
Actually,
Yeah.
before the industrial economy, but farmers only worked like 100 days a year, and then they didn't do anything.
Right.
Because of all the holidays and things like that, religious holidays, there were tons of them.
Well, also in between, the harvests and that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
Like during the winter, you're not planting, you're not,
Right.
doing anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep going.
But in reality, it's not like that. If we were really that efficient, then we wouldn't be destroying the planet with pollution. What we've done is found ways of making stuff and doing things that require very little labor, but externalize a host of other problems to a whole lot of other places.
Yeah, so the point he's making here is, do you want to say something?
Oh, I mean, you can go ahead.
Okay, so the point he's making here is that even if we're using very little labor to do stuff, we're using all these other resources or causing all these other problems that are bad for the environment, inefficient, and wasteful of resources.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think that's a valid point. I think we are not sufficiently factoring in these costs. We're emitting a lot of carbon. We're using up a lot of stuff that is maybe in excess of what we need, and the incentives aren't such that we're kind of keeping that in check. So I think I agree with him here that we need to be more efficient with our use of resources, and maybe sometimes he might be right that maybe sometimes that means we substitute some of those resources with more labor, and we need more labor working on that stuff. But it doesn't change the underlying benefit of basic income, which is that you need consumers need spending money, and no matter how much labor you need or how much labor you're using, the labor market is not going to get people optimal incomes, right?
He also kind of makes so he makes a few assumptions here.
Yeah.
One is that we would want to go in the direction in aggregate of adding more labor to combat this waste, which maybe, but I don't think he does any work to kind of convince us of that.
Adding more labor to combat.
So he's kind of implying, and he goes on to imply further that in order to save more natural resources, we actually need more people working. That the automated way to make things is somehow using more resources than a non-automated way.
Okay.
And that's why he thinks that we actually don't have a labor surplus.
Okay.
But it's not clear to me that that the things that are causing all these externalities is the automation piece at all.
Yeah.
In fact, we talk a lot about in here how people having jobs that don't really need to happen
Right.
also uses up a lot of
Right,
resources
yes.
with commuting and using
Commuting,
gas
yeah.
and
Mhm.
like
Right.
you know lots of different kinds of things
Yeah.
like that. So
Yeah.
so it's not obvious to me that like he doesn't do anything to convince you that it would go in the direction of
Right.
like in order to conserve natural resources you need more people doing these jobs.
Right.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
so I think that's like the biggest concern that I had with
Yeah.
this.
And even if he's right, it doesn't mean basic income is a bad idea. It just changes the amount of basic income we can afford or we can sustain, right? Like if we need people to be working more, then maybe the basic income should be lower or something like that.
Right.
It's not like should we have basic income or not. It's
Right.
okay, you know, now we need to
Right.
Yeah.
But I guess I'm like a lot more sympathetic. Not that it matters whether we're like blaming him or not, but like it's easier for me to see how he wouldn't have that point of view because the way that most people talk about basic income, it isn't the way that you talk about it, where it could be very, very small, it could be large, it's kind of like calibrated to all these other variables.
right.
Usually people start with the idea of something like there's a surplus of labor, or like there's not, you know, whatever, there's going to be automation, and then we need a you know, so they have a certain idea about how much basic income is going to happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Or how
so
it's going to come about, like Andrew Yang's ideas.
Right.
Yeah.
yeah. So
Some
so
people
I-
equate certain people's conceptions of how to implement basic income with the definition of basic income
right.
in the first
So I
place.
think you're unusual in saying like,
Yeah, because
oh,
they only
like
know of one or two
right.
Right, yeah.
possibilities. Yeah.
Like oh, like we want to have it as a basic piece of infrastructure that's kind of like moving with these other things, which means it could be very, very small. Could if we needed a lot of labor to like save resources or something like that. Like that's kind of a view that most people don't
Yeah.
talk about. But yeah, is if he did think about it, maybe he might agree and just say like, okay, but then if it's going to be small, like I don't think it's a big priority in the first place.
Sure. So Rick's asking a really good question, which is, couldn't that be done now, i.e. using taxes to
Yeah,
conserve
right.
resources, et cetera, without UBI? But it doesn't happen. And the answer is, yeah, it can be done to some extent.
Like gasoline taxes.
Yeah, gasoline taxes, you know, we talk about carbon taxes, and, you know, we do have these kinds of taxes that punish or charge a fee for doing certain kinds of things that are costly to the environment and to the economy and stuff like that. So yeah, it can be done. And then there's an interesting question, which is why isn't it done more than it is to the extent that we're eliminating waste to an optimal level? And I think part of the problem is something that can be solved with UBI. I think a lot of times when we talk about limiting these kinds of things, the question invariably comes up, well, how is this going to hurt ordinary people? How is this going to make their lives more difficult, that kind of thing. Whereas if you had the basic income in place, then everyone has this kind of baseline of benefit, and it's not like you shut down the coal industry and people are out of work and therefore suffering. It's now you shut down the coal industry and people have their basic income and they can spend their time how they choose, and if they want to find another job they can, and that kind of thing. So there's less, perhaps with the basic income in place, there's going to be less of a pushback against these kinds of conservation policies.
Like with the Yellow Jackets protesting the gasoline tax.
So this is a perfect example. The Yellow Vest movement in France, was a bunch of working class people who protested against the institution of a carbon tax, is essentially what it was, right? Or a gas tax. Yeah. So the idea from the government's perspective was they wanted to be more conscientious of the environment and not contribute as much to emissions and stuff like that. But that affected a lot of people directly because people had jobs that kind of depended on being able to buy a certain amount of gas to be able to commute to different areas, or that kind of thing. With UBI in place, there's less of that. There's less of people's kind of dependence on existing systems of that may be wasteful, because people's jobs are very much entrenched in existing systems. Does that make sense?
I have a few more things to say.
Yeah, go ahead.
So according to your view, where you calibrate the basic income, it still could be that like massive carbon taxes, for example, would decrease the amount of the basic income, at least in the short term, if like we're kind of pushing those externalities off on the future right now.
Yes.
But the difference is that effect would be like quite diffuse. Whereas like right now, a lot of these things like hit specific groups of people a lot more, and so then those people are like quite motivated to push
Yes.
back on them, and like the effect of like, even if it's kind of the same cost, like making it diffuse sort of psychologically and in terms of well-being can often be like a lower cost than like a few people have no way to eat and then like everybody else is not
Yeah.
affected. So I think that, but I just wanted to point out that it could affect the amount of basic income.
Yeah.
Like with the, I believe in Indiana, Andrew Yang talked about this slow roll with truck drivers. They weren't protesting automation because most of them don't know about it yet. They were protesting being monitored for they can only drive for like 12 hours a day or something like that.
Oh,
Right.
for safety. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is. What was I going to say?
Is that what does slow roll mean?
They go like 10 miles per hour or something
okay.
like that, and so it holds up traffic.
Right. There was
Yeah.
something that you were pointing out about the letting smoke come out on purpose.
That's rolling coal.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and
There's
that's
this
protesting
culture.
environmental
Protesting
restrictions.
environmental restrictions, yeah.
Right.
So there's this culture of like some people they set up their trucks to kind of
Right.
bypass the emission stuff and
Right.
belch out
Yeah.
all kinds of smoke.
Great.
And then they see like a Prius coming along and they'll let it rip and all this coal coming into the air because they're trying to like cancel out
Right.
the Prius and that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. So it's
Man.
I mean it's funny but it's also
Yeah, it's
sad.
terrible.
Yeah. So I think Bethany's point was a good point that if we are kind of conserving resources and limiting our emissions and pollution and that kind of stuff, that actually might restrict how prosperous we can be or how rich we can be. Like in order to conserve resources, we as a society might have to accept that we're going to be a little bit poorer, and that means a lower basic income. But as you said, that cost is diffuse, and it's something kind of we all decide together, and we all kind of take the hit together. Yeah, and I think that makes a big difference. So Rick says, I can't see the government using tax to direct consumption toward one company over another. Corporations already successfully lobby the government, and UBI seems to need a reduction in corporate influence on the government. So I'm not sure I understand that point.
Well, I think like one thing that I relate to in the point, and I'm not sure, Rick, that I'm getting the whole point, but like, we were talking about one factor that affects the popularity of something like a carbon tax. But of course, there's another factor, which is like the oil companies themselves lobbying and the Koch brothers, if they're involved, like there's other things we've talked about in here that are not so relevant to like the big picture social well-being effect, but really have to do with special interests that have a lot of money, and those aren't really changed by a basic income necessarily. So that could still be a limitation in terms of like using resources sustainably, I suppose. Yeah,
it is interesting though, because a lot of times when corporations lobby, they talk about the workers and the plight of the workers, and if you have a basic income in place, then that at least takes away one of their tools they can use to make their arguments. So I'm not saying that that basic income will completely end lobbying or fix this problem, but it does make it harder to argue that there's some effect that's going to hurt workers or something like that, because if we don't think of people as workers anymore and instead think of them as consumers, then it's a lot easier to say, we don't like your industry, we're going to shut it down, and those workers are just not going to be working anymore, at least at your company, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we've had a discussion in here, like kind of back and forth about like how effective UBI would be towards these kinds of measures like government taxes, and whether or to what degree would it matter to take away that aspect of it, or is that just a cover story anyway, and really like the politicians are just doing what they need to do to get like money, etc. And we'll come up with some like other cover story. Basic income does not. There are plenty of problems that basic income does not solve, and it doesn't completely fix corruption. I don't know that that's something that could be ever really completely fixed anyway, but it certainly does solve an important problem. Because if people don't have money, then you don't have an economy, and people are needlessly suffering if you can actually sustain producing for them and providing for them. Yeah.
Be real.
Hmm?
Be real.
Be real.
Be real.
Be real. The lobbying is through kickbacks, not the message to helping people. Yeah, I think that's the point that Bethany was making. So yeah, I mean that's not a problem that basic income will solve. So there are important things we need to do, in how our government is structured and how our regulations are structured, and basic income is just one thing, and it solves a very specific problem. So I don't know that it would make any of these things worse. It just doesn't address them directly. Yeah. Okay.
Good point.
Yeah.
Go see some more Rushkoff?
More Rushkoff.
Rushkoff, sorry.
Here we go.
So, we could 3D print or something, but the 3D, where do you get the plastic goop for your 3D printer? What mine in Africa is it coming out of, and what topsoil is it destroying?
Okay,
when we're
I just need to complain here.
Yeah, go ahead.
He's just making random points about how we waste resources or might waste resources, but he's not connecting them at all to whether we would need more or less labor to solve these problems. I just found this part completely
Well, I think
confusing.
for the 3D printing example, he's thinking, well, people can make them out of sustainable materials or something like that.
Oh, as opposed to using plastic?
As opposed to using automated, plastic 3D printing, that kind of thing. So you have people actually building the house instead of the house being,
Actually, there's plastic being made out of shrimp shells and things like that because it's just excess stuff that they just throw out anyway.
Right. I mean, I guess this is just a very sophisticated question of whether
Right.
having more labor. Because what about all those people commuting to build that house and there might be, and they might use more materials, and maybe a 3D printer could learn to use the sustainable materials. So the whole thing just seemed like he's kind of just randomly
it's a little
saying
cart before the horse thinking
Yeah.
too, because we're not there at all in
Right.
terms of 3D printing, and I mean,
Right.
he's
Actually,
already
it
trying to
is
solve a problem that doesn't
We don't have.
really exist.
Actually, it is in Europe and in China.
Is it?
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
It's not in America because of all the unions and things.
Oh,
Interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I guess also to Rick's points too, it's not clear that people would use more or less plastic with making people do the work themselves versus having it be having those things be made in an automated way.
Yeah.
He wasn't
Yeah.
really convincing me
Right.
that people were gonna use more or less plastic in one case or the other.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So Rick says, if basic income doesn't solve corruption, then tax can't be used to design consumer benefit as you see it, or can't be designed to conserve resources. So I think corruption is, it's not a black and white thing. There are degrees of it, right? Maybe some corruption will prevent certain taxes from coming into place that would prevent waste of resources, that kind of thing. That's entirely possible. But again, basic income, that's kind of orthogonal to the issue of basic income. If we're using resources inefficiently and there's corruption reasons for that, then basic income is not going to fix that.
I don't think it is orthogonal for Rick, because I'm trying to follow along his comments, and I
Yeah.
think that he feels that maybe the majority of the things that people buy and would buy are kind of making them less happy or not making them more happy and using up resources. That seems to be that's one interpretation, Rick. I don't know, you're not in the room, but one interpretation of his view. So giving people more money would actually make that problem worse for Rick unless you shifted what they bought in a different direction.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's also important to keep in mind that basic income on its own does not necessarily give people in aggregate more money to spend, or does not necessarily induce more overall spending, right? We have right now, the economy always has to have mechanisms to get money into the hands of consumers, right? So we have mechanisms now, including monetary expansion. So this is monetary stimulus through the central bank's monetary policy and stuff like that. So he says your description is quite accurate.
Good.
So we have consumer spending. So the question is, do we have the right distribution of consumer spending? Do we have the right levels of consumer spending? Is the consumer spending being funded in a stable way? So right now, in our world,
say that you can buy, the person can rent a better apartment or something like that instead of the one that they're in right now, or they could buy a super gas or whatever it's called instead of the regular unleaded
Yeah,
Right.
Premium, yeah.
premium. That's it.
Yeah. So I think this is kind of a point actually that Douglas Rushkoff brought up at the beginning, which is that we stimulate a lot of borrowing so that people can borrow money in order to spend, companies can borrow money in order to hire people, in order to spend, to kind of create jobs with people. All of that is going on in our economy, and when there's so much spending that's being funded by borrowing in the economy, it ends up getting more brittle over time. Like different people's debts depend on them being paid back by other people, and then you get this kind of buildup of debt in the economy.
Snowball and like
Yeah, it's kind of like an interconnected network of debt. So this is kind of like how we fund consumer spending now. And what that means is that consumer spending is largely funded by credit bubbles, and that includes, the wages that you get from your job are largely funded by, businesses being able to borrow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that gets unstable, and then we have situations like 2008. If you had instead consumer spending being funded directly by the government issuing money into the hands of consumers that doesn't have to be paid back, then you don't need these kinds of unstable credit bubbles to sustain the economy, and it gets a lot more stable. And I think everyone agrees that 2008 was not a good thing, and the Great Depression was not a good thing, and there were probably a lot of resources that were wasted in that process too. So when you talked about bailing out companies, maybe you don't need to bail out companies in the first place if we didn't have a situation where companies that maybe should not be in business were able to get really easy money by borrowing. So basic income can help with that. It allows the Fed to raise interest rates to reduce the level of borrowing in the economy. So that's just kind of like another perspective on it. It's not just that basic income increases the amount of stuff people are buying and therefore the amount of stuff that we're producing. There's more to it than that. It's more stable and perhaps more sustainable because we know that we're creating inefficiencies, and we know that we're kind of wasting resources if we're making up work for people to do. And basic income means less of that. In terms of being able to institute taxes, there might be corruption that prevents that. There also might be corruption that prevents basic income from getting implemented in the first place, and that kind of thing. So it's kind of two separate questions, like what's the kind of most efficient, optimal economy, and then how do we get there politically? And that's kind of where the corruption comes into play, and that can get really complicated. And I don't know that I would be able to give a full detailed analysis of that.
Like one of Nixon's advisors successfully convinced him of not implementing basic income because of poor explanation of Spielenham,
Spieneland.
Spielenland of proto basic income in England from 1895 to 1825, I think it is.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because they thought it was going to have people be lazy or something like that, when it will actually improve their livelihood and made them more likely to work and things.
Yeah. So a question we can ask that I think is useful to Rick's point is, even in the absence of proper taxation to conserve resources and stuff like that, is having a basic income better or worse than not having a basic income just on its own, assuming you don't make any other adjustments?
Right.
And I think the answer is that it's better, because we do know, and I think we can assume, that the Fed is going to manage monetary policy properly. So you increase consumer, or you give consumers a kind of a baseline of income, and then that allows the Fed to raise interest rates in order to keep prices stable, and it helps kind of rein in the private financial sector, which and this is automatic, right? Wall Street would shrink. The big investment banks, they wouldn't be so leveraged, that kind of thing. So on its own, you've got ordinary people have a certain baseline of what they can rely on, and the economy is more stable. Now, in terms of the government fiscally responding properly, there could be corruption there, that kind of thing. I would love for them to to do better on conserving resources. And I think that I don't know what the answer is to get them to do that, but I am confident that having a basic income on its own, independent of all that other stuff, is better than not having a basic income. Yeah.
People also wouldn't need to go to payday lenders as much and things like that.
Yeah. So basic income would change, kind of the whole financial system. So yeah, I mean, it wouldn't even be profitable for a business that looks like what today we call payday lenders. Like that's just not something that would make sense anymore if your basic income is high enough, because why would people pay that if they know they have the money coming? Yeah.
Rick wants to know what he can read about interest rates changing if there's a BVI.
Yeah, so you can actually watch. We've had a couple videos on. Yeah, there was one from a few weeks ago where we talked about debt and credit in the economy. I would recommend watching that one. That talks about that a little bit. If you really want to know about this monetary stuff, there's a course on Coursera that I really recommend called Economics of Money and Banking. Here, I'll send you the link.
It's very fun, actually.
It's very fun. It's taught by Professor Perry Merling. He's an economic historian and an expert on money. Yeah, just click that link. All the materials are free. They tell you can pay $49 to pay for the course, but you can actually just click through that and decline that offer. And the only thing you don't get if you don't pay is that after the first 4 weeks, you can't get your tests graded. But all the material is there, all the lectures are there, all the reading is there, and I think you can still look at the tests and go through and see what the questions are. You just can't get it graded. But it's a really, really great resource if you want to understand money. I like to say to people that you can't really understand basic income if you don't understand money, because it's yeah.
Cool. Let's watch
More Douglas Rushkoff.
Rushkoff.
Yeah.
Going to run out of topsoil in 60 years, it means that we're not actually using the appropriate labor-intensive permaculture solutions in agriculture and all that. So first off, that whole idea that we're moving towards lower employment.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about, like, he's claiming that we would use agriculture would be more sustainable if it were done by more laborers as opposed to like machines? I have no way to evaluate that claim. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I mean that's a really hard thing to I would like to know more about that. I mean, he's written books, so maybe he talks more. I'm sure he talks more about this in other places.
Right. Also,
yeah,
I wonder if he makes a mistake or not. I wouldn't assume, but sometimes people look at like how like a small scale farm is like more sustainable in the sense of like it can grow a small amount of food sort of more sustainably, but maybe there's the question of like scaling up and feeding a lot of people without taking over like a lot more natural land to use as farmland or like that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't know if he's making that particular mistake, but I mean, you're right that small scale farming, small local farms, organic farms, that kind of stuff is much worse for the environment than conventional farms that produce at scale and use resources more efficiently. And sometimes it looks like those factory farms, et cetera, are more damaging to the environment. But often what you're seeing is that all of the kind of negative effects are concentrated in one place.
Right, as opposed to
whereas if you have a small farm, you can't really see it.
Right.
But in terms of if you took all of the small farms that added up to one big farm, the cumulative negative externalities of those small farms would usually be greater than the big farm.
As a concrete just speculation, like I wonder if there would be much incentive to be cutting down the rainforest to farm, for example, if like those people were getting money to buy like food from America that's like farmed in the heartland anyway.
I mean, I think that's a really great point. And I think we're forcing people to produce a lot more food than is actually needed in the global economy. And that might sound
like
weird.
You said, like we burn food and stuff like that too.
Right. Yeah. And that might sound weird because we have people who are still starving and stuff like that. But Steve and I were talking before that, it's not that there's not enough food being produced. And it's also not that, rich people are wasting too much food. It's that the poor people don't have the money to buy food.
Right.
And if you get rich people to waste less, maybe you can figure out some sort of system for distributing that food to the poor, that kind of thing. But that's much less efficient than just giving poor people money so they can buy food.
In places like Kuwait, they actually put gold flakes and things like that on their food.
There you go, little gold flake spice. But I mean, we don't need people in South America to be growing their own food, by and large.
And
That's
cutting down the rainforest.
cutting down the rainforest. Yeah, they're doing that because they're desperate for survival, and we're forcing them to, the global economy is kind of forcing them to be self-sufficient.
Or you can, in like the Congo, they're cutting down the rainforest because they don't know the benefits they could get from tourism.
Right.
From people wanting to see the mountain gorillas and things.
Right.
Wow.
That's interesting. Yeah. But there's if you think about it, efficiency in a different way, there's certain areas of the world or the planet that aren't as damaged by farming, or that don't have entire ecosystems like the rainforest does, that you really want to preserve. And if people have money all over the world, those places can efficiently produce the food. Yeah. And then send them to other people.
And actually, in Norway, there's funds where they want to we'll pay you not to cut down the trees so you can have carbon trapping and things.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty cool.
So that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think as far as food production goes, there's a lot of exciting developments that can help make it more efficient, vertical farming, hydroponics, aeroponics, that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, this lab at MIT that I toured, where they just needed a few minerals and a little bit of water, and not even that much, and they had recipes. They were figuring out you can type in the amount of the different minerals in the water, and you could do all of that in a building.
And you can genetically engineer those plants so they're even more efficient with hydroponics and things.
Yep. Yeah, so there's lots of possibilities for making food more efficient. The one he's suggesting is getting people to do more manual farming, and on the face of it, that does not sound like...
It seems super inefficient. I don't know why that... But I don't know the details, so I don't know.
Yeah. I think he mentioned crop rotation, and that's something that is useful and more efficient. That's when you grow different crops in different places and that kind of thing. But that can be done at scale too.
Yeah, legumes with peanuts. You can put that there for one season and put another thing there.
Yeah.
I also wonder if small scale farming uses these things more because maybe there are already people who are attractive to people who want to have a more I don't know, who want organic food or something like that. But theoretically, you could do it at scale. You could theoretically rotate crops at scale.
Yeah,
I just wonder why the incentive isn't there to do it. Maybe.
Are you sure that it isn't? Do large farms not rotate crops?
Maybe they do, yeah.
Yeah.
No, they just put a lot of fertilizer there.
Okay.
Yeah, there might be other dynamics of
Yeah.
And there's in the Mississippi River, there's this whole dead zone because of all the...
Right.
Because of the algae.
You can see it this huge
and maybe there's a lot of returns to specializing in a particular crop in terms of your equipment and your expertise, and I don't know. But.
So that's something we'd probably want to address. But I don't think the answer is to scale everything down.
Well, I think sometimes people miss, we said, the environmental waste of that.
Actually, the reason why there's all the plume is because we don't regulate it enough. And they don't have enough inspectors to see that they're using too much fertilizer.
Right.
Yeah. So then it's the question of regulation and, how do you get that through the politics and stuff like that.
Tough. That's really tough.
It's a tricky thing. But yeah, the answer is still not to make things... Not to scale things down. I don't think that's the right way to go.
Is he against this yet? I mean, have we reached the part where he's against?
Yeah, this is the part where he's against it.
This is the part where he's against it. He's basically saying that basic income is something that we need to do because we don't want to make up jobs for people, but actually we do need to put people to work doing these things because it would be less harmful to the environment.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why I keep wondering, is it actually important to put people to work? Or whatever. But
so Rick says I've seen people get very good wages and still use payday loans.
Oh, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I don't think that will go away because people who cannot use money properly won't start using it well once you get
true.
I think that might be right. Like, you might still have some payday loans.
True.
So right, so I
how
mean,
much money you have, you're always kind of behind.
right.
Yeah.
So a lot of people might not be using money well, but then the question is, what's profitable? What's a profitable business, right? So if you know that everyone has money coming, regardless of whether they have a job, how much interest are you going to be able to charge them, right? If everybody knows that, then they'll be competing each other down on how much interest there is. So you might still have, the payday lending business, but the interest rates won't be as high because they can't get anyone to borrow at the high interest rates anymore. Because,
one of the things that Andrew Yang is in favor of is the financial literacy courses that were taught in like senior year of high school and things.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Yeah.
I think that, like, your point, Alex, is like that part of why the payday loans are so high is that they're managing the risk of like so many people not paying them back.
Yes.
And that risk would be lower with a UBI because people have a steady income, and so like.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
So
if everybody knows the
interest
risk
rates
is
would be lower.
lower, then you can't charge a high rate if all your competitors are charging a lower rate.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely true that people might still be irresponsible with their money, but that doesn't mean that it's still going to be profitable to have businesses like payday lenders existing in the economy. People might still borrow money, but
Maybe at a lower interest rate.
it's going to be at a lower interest rate. Yeah.
Cool. I think Rick's next points relate to what Rushkoff is about to say.
What Rushkoff is about to say.
We're going to say a little bit.
All
soon.
right, let's play.
Is a myth. We've faked lower employment through extremely extractive, exploitative, polluting, and unsustainable business practices.
So I just want
lower employment.
faked, right? Because we're actually still using just as much resources before, or maybe causing more pollution as a way of getting labor down, as a way of reducing.
We actually try to get labor
but
up.
it's not
I know.
faking unemployment to do that. I don't.
Well, he still has this
term.
view that like to use resources sustainably requires more employment,
Right.
which
Right.
is what I keep pushing back on.
It's not that we've faked lower employment; it's that we've faked the idea that we need lower employment.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah,
so that's basically
right,
the point that
right,
he's
right.
making. Why did I pause this?
I don't know. I feel like we've talked about this already.
Yeah, but I was going to say something specific. I don't know. We'll
Do you
just
want to
keep going.
replay it or?
Yeah, sure.
Like you could use steam engines or you could have 40 people plowing the field or something.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
All right. So here we go.
We've faked lower employment through extremely extractive, exploitative, polluting, and unsustainable business practices.
Yeah. So I just wanted to point out that we haven't like kind of what Bethany says. We haven't necessarily achieved lower employment or as low employment as we could achieve because we're using all kinds of economic policy to create jobs for people. So maybe we've faked the idea. Maybe what he's saying is we faked the idea that we could lower employment, but we haven't actually faked, or we don't actually have lower employment. I mean, maybe we have slightly lower labor force participation rate, but the employment level is still very high, and we're constantly creating jobs for people. And obviously, I think he would agree. I think Rushkoff would agree that the jobs that we're creating for people are not the kinds of jobs that he's imagining that will help conserve other resources and stuff like that. But I think it can be true at the same time that we are forcing people to do useless work, and there's useful work that's not being done, or beneficial work that's not being done. And I think both of those things are true in our economy, right? I don't know that I agree with what he thinks should be the useful work, like having more manual labor on farms and stuff like that. But certainly there are things that need doing that aren't getting done, like infrastructure maintenance and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
We actually this week we passed $2 trillion in infrastructure bill.
Oh, great! Good for us.
Good times.
I hope we build that infrastructure using as little labor as possible, but also not causing too much pollution.
and also with superior practices like what I described last week with the bacteria in the cement, that if there's a crack, it fills it.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's cool.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
And like with the drones inspecting the beams and the Internet of Things, we're measuring the vibrations and whatnot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Here we go.
Cool.
And second, I was giving a talk at Uber. And I was talking to them about the problems with their business model and how they're putting all these drivers out of work. And here they are, these freelancers working for the company, basically training the algorithms that will be replacing them.
So obviously, I don't think this is a problem. We want to put as many people out of work as possible. That's fine. In an ideal world, people have as much freedom as possible to spend their time how they choose, and that
People's
means
time is valuable.
people's time is like the most valuable thing. And if there's jobs that people are doing that could be automated away that we don't need, then that's a good thing to get rid of them. But it's hard to think about it that way when you're expecting people to get their incomes.
Yeah,
from
of course.
labor.
Yeah, I mean, of course it is.
Yeah.
It is.
So yeah,
I'll keep going.
Keep going.
Play more of it.
No, without any profit participation in the end game company. And one of the guys got up and basically quoted back to me a passage from my own book, Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus. He said, well, what about universal basic income? And when I heard it coming out of their mouths, I realized, oh, so universal
here, pause.
basic income.
This is where I don't trust his motives. Remember I told you at home I don't trust his. I don't mean I don't trust his motives like deeply. Like I think he is trying to make things better, but I also think he's like more political than intellectual. Or this makes me wonder about that because it seems like it was like, oh, when the people he like thinks of as bad or the enemy, or he's already come out with a book criticizing, are in favor of a certain thing, then he's not going to be in favor of that thing.
right.
Which is more of like a political than an intellectual kind of understanding the economy perspective.
Right. Yeah.
It's like more of an in-group, out-group, or like a personal consistency thing where he's already come out against those kinds of companies.
Right.
I'm not even sure what you're referring to yet because I
Oh,
don't know what the
so
whole
he
thing
just
is.
basically he says like one of the things that changed his mind about basic income is that he heard people at places like Uber in favor of basic income, or like using it as, he would say, using it as an excuse for practices he doesn't agree with
I see.
in their company. And he could say like, oh, well, like I don't think that's an excuse for XYZ, or like, he could have different views, but basically it seems like that's one of the things that convinces him to be against basic income, is that like Uber seems to be in favor of it, or
What's the
about it.
quote from his book that he's talking about? That
He never specifies exactly.
I guess the quote from the book is just the idea that basic income is something we can use to address some of the problems caused by these job losses, right?
Okay.
But now the Uber person is saying that basic income is something we can use to address these job losses. And he's thinking, well, wait a minute, you're the one who's creating the job losses.
Right.
I don't want you to do that. And now you're using basic income as an excuse to continue doing
I
that.
see.
But, the question is, if basic income actually is the answer, and it does allow us to eliminate jobs without, hurting people's incomes, then maybe eliminating the jobs is a good thing. Or,
But he doesn't want to go
Rick makes
back
a good
on
point.
what
I was
his
going to say,
original-
like, to his credit, he goes on to like make more of a substantive point in a minute. So fair enough. Rick's saying that I shouldn't necessarily judge him on how he came to the point.
I think that's right. But there's
that's
also
fair.
a reason why he brought this up in
that's also a
his
good
video,
point.
right? In his,
Like
his
maybe
little
the
talk
audience
here.
is thinking like, oh, I also don't like Uber, and like somehow
Right.
I'm-
So there is a political aspect to it, and we'll judge him based on his reasoning. But the fact that he even brought this up, and the fact that this had so much impact on how he was thinking about basic income reveals something about how he's feeling about it. Yeah.
So yeah, but maybe we should. So Rick brought up a few points earlier that I think are. I told you were related to what he's going to say. I think he's going to say that stuff now.
Okay.
His more substantive point about the Uber.
Let's play it. Yeah.
Isn't just a way to help people have the money they need to survive and have time to innovate and come up with other solutions. It's becoming an excuse for companies like Uber to not pay a living wage to their
I
workers.
see. Okay.
That's not even the point I was talking about.
Well, let's talk about this
But
point.
we can talk about this.
Because it's interesting because even though he was supportive of basic income, he still believed that people should be paid a living wage. Like that was the moral thing to do.
It is kind of
So it seems like he
yeah.
didn't have a complete understanding of
Right.
what basic income was for,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Because part of the problem that we're trying to solve here is this expectation that people earn a living from the labor market,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
And that's not going to be true in an efficient labor market.
Right.
Yeah.
Actually, I read an article today about the IPO for Uber on Friday about how they're paying lower wages right now in anticipation that their job's going to be automated away, which is really weird
Oh yeah, I saw that.
because
Yep.
there's not
Yeah.
going to be automated away for like 5 or 10 years, but it's before they're lowering wages beforehand.
Why would they be able to lower wages beforehand?
Is that so they can lower fares? So they're
Oh.
trying to like bring the fares down because they, even though they can't afford it right now, they know that they will be able to afford it in the future, and they're trying to like be competitive. That
Something
kind of
like
thing.
that.
But
Yeah.
don't they still have to pay enough to get the people to do the job?
You have to pay enough to get the people to do the job. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that's an interesting question.
Right.
You know, how do you ensure that there are enough drivers and stuff like that? It seems like that would be independent of
Right.
of how much you want to pay them.
But in
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
the article also talks about how in New York they unsuccessfully fought a bill that has people earning minimum wage for working at Uber
Interesting.
and Lyft and whatever.
Yeah. So I guess it would make sense to me if they were lowering the fares and taking
Yeah. I
a
wonder
loss.
if they're taking a loss. For now.
But it doesn't make sense to me that they would lower the wages because then you're disincentivizing the drivers and you need a certain number of drivers
Right.
or wages or what they're
Yeah.
paying the drivers, I suppose.
Oh, but I
yeah.
saw another article about how people are not particularly well informed about getting into Uber, and there's all these sunken costs, and so the people feel that they have to
I see.
burn back the
Oh,
money
I
to.
see.
So the drivers are locked in, so it's not
especially
like
I think if they get their car through Uber, right?
Right,
Then they
right.
kind of get
The
like
car
is that
what?
what I'm
not
thinking?
even if they get their car through Uber, but if they get their car in anticipation
Oh,
of
yeah.
paying it back using the money
Yeah.
they get from Uber, now they're kind of locked in.
Yeah. I feel like Uber is more beneficial for people like my friend John who already had a car
Right.
and like didn't buy it in anticipation of Uber or anything and just like really needed something flexible that could happen right away.
Right.
There must be
But yeah, that's
requirements
not
for the
everybody.
cars. Are there? Do
Yeah,
they
but
do car
he
checks?
already had a decent car, I think.
But I mean, does Uber have a policy on what kind of cars and how old they
It
are?
must
They have
be that it has to be
requirements,
They
safe.
do have,
Yeah.
they must.
Yeah.
Standards for cars.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Huh.
But I think that's like probably what they tout as what's supposed quote unquote supposed to happen. But as Richard points out, maybe a lot of people maybe end up buying their car in
Yeah.
anticipation.
Yeah.
of-
Yeah, I
They
mean-
get permits and stuff too, and those cost money.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Oh,
And
they
I-
need
and I
permits
think-
like taxis? Not like medallions, but some kind
No.
of permits? I didn't know that.
That's what I understood from
know.
the.
I'm not sure what
John
kind of
had to
permit
get
they
a
need.
permit. I think. I mean,
They,
I don't,
yeah.
No, there might be like rideshare permits and stuff. Like
Yeah.
it's not taxi medallions, but like over the years, as the rideshare stuff has gotten more prominent, they've tried to regulate it more and more. So I'm not sure what.
Yeah, I
what that
feel
would
like
be.
John
Yeah.
just picked it up without much cost.
Yeah.
So like it can be. I mean, people have been down on Uber a lot, but it can be like a really flexible. If somebody just finds themselves like in need of something that they can do right away to make money and do it in their own hours without much requirements
Sure.
and like not having to get a job yet first or anything like that, like with just his position, then it was really great for. I mean, it's really great for him.
Yeah.
yeah.
And
And
it's to pass a background check. And
Yeah, you do have to pass
Right,
background check and stuff. Yeah.
And it's interesting about the. It's interesting. Oh, I don't know what I was going to say.
Oh, I was
Right.
going to ask about this whole concept of if you're getting basic income, he's saying then you have an excuse not to pay
Right.
minimum wage.
Sure.
And that's a bad thing. from
He's
his
saying that's
point
a
of
bad
view.
thing. Yeah.
But they're not really connected that way. I mean, I'm not sure why. I mean, the company might see it as a connected thing because
Right.
companies could say, well, then they start calibrating their wages based on what they know to be the minimum wage. I mean, the basic income,
Right.
right? No,
Yeah.
that is a point. I mean, that
Well,
actually has.
Right. I mean, it is a point. The labor market is a market, right? So companies are going to pay whatever they have to pay to get the people to do the work, and generally speaking, they're going to pay as little as possible,
Right.
And no more than that, right? So then the question is, how does basic income affect wages? And I think
Or competitiveness between and among companies, then they would want to, charge as much as they can, of course, but then they have to now include the basic income as part of the calculation. And so all of them would then be kind of recalibrating.
It's not that they directly include the basic income as part of the calculation. It's that they're always going to be paying what they need to pay to get people to work.
Right.
So the question is, what amount of money are people willing to work for?
Right.
And like we talked about
So
last
it's
time,
less of a calculation on the part of the companies and more of a calculation on the part of the workers.
Well,
the potential workers, right?
that becomes part of the calculation.
But I guess, like we said last
Yeah,
time,
so-
some jobs might be that you have to pay people more because now
Right.
they have a basic income. They don't
Right.
have to
No,
work
I
there.
yeah.
Right.
I know that
People might
argument, but
pay
I'm
them
thinking
less,
about in
yeah.
the view of the employer now, rather than the
Right.
power that.
Right.
now
So
the
so
employer-
depending on what type of job you need people to do, if that job is something
Right.
that people really, really don't want to do, and a basic income is in place and they have an outside option, now you might have to pay people more to do that job.
Yeah, no,
If
I
it's-
know that thinking.
If it's a job that people really do want to do, then you
Yeah.
don't have to pay them as much.
No, I know,
Right.
Yeah.
but from the employer's point of view, that maybe
Yeah.
those jobs that nobody wants to do, they can calibrate it based on the basic income. All of them can. All of the companies now can look at that as a factor that wasn't there before.
I'm not sure I'm following.
Well,
What do you mean by look at it as a factor?
Well,
Well-
she's thinking they'll be like, oh, those people already have money from the basic income, so we don't have to pay them as much.
Is that what you're saying?
Right, and the
Well-
competition would be how little we can pay them, but always it is. But
Right.
then now they're adding in this other factor of the basic income.
Well,
So it does
doesn't
affect-
matter what they add in.
It does affect their
But
calculation.
the
It
point is,
doesn't-
people might not be, they can offer a low wage and maybe people could survive on it, but
Right. The question is whether they
It'd
can
be
get
higher
people.
because they have to compete now with people who don't want that job, so it would be higher, but it might not be that much higher.
Yeah, it would
You
depend
know-
on the amount of the basic income and
Yeah.
how much people dislike that job. And,
Right, yeah. It's
Yeah.
not a done deal that somebody would not now take a job that they didn't want, just because they have a basic income.
I'm not following you at all.
Okay.
I don't,
Like
I
with
don't know.
are you talking like the Cali burger with the automated like flipping of the burgers and things,
Kelly burger. No.
and how people don't really like doing that, so they don't want to pay $15 an hour, so we're going to automate that job away or something like that.
Yeah. No. I'm thinking more about kind of what
So
he's talking about.
you can't just lower the wages because people need to be willing to work at the wage that you're offering, right?
Right.
So I think one of the
Yeah.
issues with what he's bringing up, this guy, like one of
Yeah.
the ways in which I think this is confusing,
Yeah.
is he's making it sound like any of this calculation has to do with like thinking about the worker. So let me back up. So he's like raising a question with a company that has like maybe some motive to like appear somewhat socially conscious, and so they're bringing up basic income to kind of say like, look, like, well, those people will like still be okay who like lose their jobs or
Right.
like that. But really, like, I think that's kind of a side note to how like companies are going to be geared. Sometimes you can get them to be kind of a little bit socially aware, but like you pointed out, they're generally geared towards trying to make a profit anyway. And so
this
like the
wouldn't be
fact that
such a
people,
big
yeah, so it's
disincentive.
not
Yeah,
like really
yeah,
changing that because
right.
they're not all anyway
Yeah,
like
right,
considering.
That's what I was thinking
and in
about,
a
that
certain
change, yeah.
perspective, like I think Uber could have had a different answer, like from the perspective we often talk about here, which is like, why are you putting it on companies to take care of these kinds
Yep.
of needs? Like that's the
Right.
role of the government,
Yeah.
not necessarily
Right.
the role of the company. In fact, it works against the grain of what allows a company to
Right.
survive in competition with other companies.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so-
and you're right. Most companies aren't thinking, well, I really should pay more.
Right.
because
I mean, to
they
some
deserve-
degree,
they-
a little bit they
yeah.
might, but
Right.
you know, I'm
yeah,
not
for
saying
the
there's
most
no
part, they're
human
not thinking
element
that
in
way
it,
anyway.
but-
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you
Right.
understood what I was trying to get at.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
but that that
Uh,
kind of negates what he's putting forth. That the idea that the company now knows that they can earn a good enough, they have basic income, so they don't really have to give them
Right,
minimum
because I don't
wage.
think that was what was setting the wage.
Yeah.
anyway.
Right, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The idea.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. What's setting the wage is still what wage are they willing to work for?
Right.
Right,
And
right,
some
right.
and
If you
laws.
pay less than that, then you're
Yeah,
not going to
yeah,
have any
yeah.
workers.
Yeah,
And the
right.
law,
Yeah.
whatever
Yeah.
law sets
Yeah.
as like the minimum wage
Okay,
too. But
thank you.
Yeah.
Going on that side trip.
That's fine. Yeah.
But he gets to like another point here, which I keep
Alright.
feeling bad we've ignored one of Rick's points, which is like the same as this point. I think
Okay.
that's coming now. I keep
Let's
thinking
go.
it's coming.
Let's see if it's this time. Yeah.
So what's the idea? Oh, we'll get the government to print more money to give it to workers for them to spend with us.
Hell yeah. Right? I mean, like,
Right.
this is what we want, right? We
Right.
want people to be able to benefit from the economy, and that's the way you do it. Is you spend money and you buy it from the people who are providing the service or producing the good, and
Right.
and that's something that's sustainable. That's something that,
presenting it as
Yeah.
outlandish.
Well, he
Yeah.
okay, so he gets to more concerns with it in a second.
Let's see.
all right.
But I mean, I agree with you, Alex. But I think
Yeah.
to be fair to his
So
point,
what really happens? What is universal basic income? It's just a way of perpetuating our roles as consumers.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's the most important role that people have in the economy. The economy exists for the benefit of the people, and we consume that benefit. That's the whole point of the
I
economy.
feel like here's
Yeah,
where
like-
language gets messy. Like if
Yeah.
like the word consumer has so many different connotations.
Yeah,
as
I
we've been
know.
seeing
We talked
with,
about that
with
last
Nick,
week.
but like
Yeah.
the primary like beneficiaries, the primary the beneficiaries of the economy, like I think captures more like
Like
what your vision is, right?
Bill Gates only needs so many pairs of pants, or can only eat so many hamburgers.
Right.
So if you give this $1 billion to so many people, they're going to buy so many pairs of pants and hamburgers,
Right.
and that's what keeps the improvement of pants or whatever.
People get more pants. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that like I think saying that people who are benefiting from the economy are at the bottom is interesting.
Yeah.
Like framing the consumers as being
at the bottom of the pyramid is what he says. If he
Right.
hasn't said it already.
and that it's kind of like a disadvantage or something.
Right.
Oh,
But the point that Rick is making, I think he might make earlier, like in a minute too, but we might as well just
Yeah.
go to it, is like the other potential negative effects. So what you would have if you have more money flowing through the economy is like more money accumulating in the hands of like the Ubers of the world and so on, right?
Right.
And so Rick pointed out before that like this could be a problem if that money equates to political power, which is something we've talked
Yeah, we
about in
talked
this
about
group
that.
before.
Yeah.
And he might talk about, I forget. a
So
little bit
yeah,
too,
I mean,
but-
we've talked about political power, and I think that giving money to the poor is going to empower them far more than taking any amount of money away from the rich.
Yeah.
So like if you have the basic income and people have this spending money, they have this freedom, that's a lot of political power right there. And you can take all kinds of money away from the rich, and it's not going to have that effect, because power is kind of like a zero-sum thing, right? Like if some people have more power, then other people have less power. So the way to kind of take power away from the rich is to give power to the poor. It's not to take money from the rich. Yeah,
That's how the Yellow Jackets are able to protest during the weekends and things, because they don't have to worry about health care, and they don't have to worry about how they're going to pay the rent and things.
Yeah, I guess I agree with you that it would give a lot of power to the poor. I guess I still wonder, like when it comes to let's say, like I know we'd want to also reform maybe like campaign donations, but like when it comes
Yeah.
to like even let's say like shady things that got around the laws, like if you just have that many more dollars than everybody else, then you do kind of have like the influence equivalent of the number of people who have like if your income is worth like 100,000 people's income, in some domains you actually have 100,000 people's influence. Like it does scale in some domains. So like for example, when people are trying to figure out charity, like a charity wants to like get donations, they can try to reach 100,000 people, or they can try to reach you, right? And that's actually a calculus that charities make all the time, where like they just decide like, should we even bother trying to reach the general public, or should we just go talk to this one guy
Right.
who has so much more money relative to the general
Right,
public?
right.
And so that is a kind of power and influence, and there probably is some of that in government too, that really does scale up with the dollars that you have. That's the part that I do worry about.
Going and having big fundraisers and
Right.
celebrities and people with real money.
Right, exactly.
I mean, that's what
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders did that was so unusual, going and getting $20
Oh, yeah.
contributions, and now everybody's kind of doing
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Because
right.
it's an optics thing
Yeah.
more than anything.
Yeah.
They're still looking for that one or two or three
exactly
big money people.
exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the part that I don't see. Like, it isn't totally addressed for me by what you raised about poor people having more time or people having more time.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's not.
Yeah.
No, well, yeah, not just about time, right?
Oh, it's about time and money. So
Yeah,
the people and freedom, right? To do what you want.
Well, and also education. I mean, it's amazing
Right.
how many people don't really know anything about
Right.
politics. They're completely tied into, I don't know, worship, fandom, that sort of thing, cult personalities. They don't
Yeah.
really know anything about how government works.
Yeah.
And so, you
And
need
that's-
time to do that.
So-
You need time to educate yourself on a lot of those
Yeah.
things.
And I mean, I think that's always going to be the case, that the vast majority of people do not understand the government
Right.
or are thinking
Oh.
about it in very simplistic
Okay.
ways.
Like with our president who doesn't know that the Supreme Court can't rule in on what the House of Representatives impeaching him.
Well, having an
Yeah.
uneducated president
So-
is not the same.
Well, that's kind of a
thing.
separate issue.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
separate issue.
By the way,
But
Rick
he
was
has
pointing out
plenty
that
of
I said
time.
Rick said, but he was actually quoting Douglas.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I think it's always going to be the case, and this is why we have a representative democracy, is that the people who are experts
Yeah.
on this stuff are going to be representing the people who aren't.
Right.
So it's always going to be tricky to, you're never going to have a perfectly informed public who's making
No,
smart
but
decisions.
you can have a
You're
more
not gonna-
informed public.
You
Some
can
people
have,
don't
right,
believe.
exactly. That's
Yeah.
exactly right.
Right.
So you can have a more informed public. So if
Yeah.
you give people the freedom to
Yeah.
do what they want,
Read
some
more.
of them
Yeah.
some of them will become more informed,
Yeah.
and some of them will be making smarter decisions, influencing politics in smarter ways, and that kind of thing.
There's
Yeah.
something called a fluid democracy where you can give your votes to a person who would make the decision for you. It's
Right.
sort of like a representative democracy where you can, but you can switch your vote, your voting power to some person over time,
Right.
wherever you feel like
Yeah.
it,
Right.
instead of every 2 years or every 4 years or every 6 years.
Right. It's like a direct democracy where everyone votes on everything, except most people are just assigning their vote to someone else.
Yeah.
So maybe I assign my vote to Bethany,
Right.
and
So you can do the research and follow it, and
Yeah,
you
but-
don't have to.
right. But maybe I assign my vote to Bethany, and you assign your vote to Bethany. So now Bethany is representing 3 votes, including her own.
Yeah.
But she assigns her votes to Steve, right?
Yeah.
So it can be like this hierarchical thing.
Right,
So it's like
interesting.
I trust Bethany to put my vote in a smart place,
Right,
and then
right.
and she'll use her
Right.
knowledge to put.
And
put
they're
those
able
votes
to
in a smart
combat
place.
people like paying for other people's votes and stuff like that.
Combat people paying for other people's votes. What
Like,
does
I
that
was just
mean?
thinking of a kind of corruption where, like, I pay you to give me your vote.
Are you asking how would we combat that?
Or, like, if this is in practice, I assume they.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to figure out a way to address these things. Yeah, I'm not a proponent of this system.
It's interesting.
But I think it's something that people bring up a lot.
Cool.
Yeah.
No, we're running out of time, so maybe
Yeah.
we should watch the rest of this.
All right, more Douglas Rushkoff.
At the bottom of the pyramid, not as owners.
Oh, yeah, that's
If
right.
we're going to go to anything, I would say, what about universal basic assets?
Universal
Yeah.
basic what? Access?
Assets.
Assets.
Okay.
Okay.
So this is now you own the business, or you own the
Okay.
investment
Is this, like,
or
stock
something like
options or
that.
something?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean it's any kind of asset that you own. So we're gonna like give people houses and give people shares in
Okay.
firms and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I think this is a silly idea.
Yeah.
I think the
Yeah,
whole
like right after the Soviet Union collapsed, they gave the shares of the Alcoa and things like that to the people, but they didn't have any financial literacy, so they sold the assets to these people who went around who were representing these conglomerates.
yeah most people.
And so they sold it for really cheaply, and so that's how the magnates got all their money.
Yeah, most people don't care about managing assets. And for the people who do care about managing the ownership of assets, they're managing it to be able to get the best income stream out of it. Anyway, so the ultimate goal is the income stream, right?
Right.
So
Point.
instead of providing people with assets that they have to manage, just provide them with the income stream directly.
Yeah.
If they want to, they can use that income stream to buy assets if they really want to be people who own assets.
That's like
So
the
I think
middleman thing.
yeah,
Like
so
the
universal
jobs.
basic assets feels like a backwards approach here. I think the answer is the basic income, and then people can decide how much they want to think about managing financial resources and stuff like that.
Maybe we can actually do a discussion on universal basic assets.
You think there's more to say than what I just said?
I'm sure probably there is. Mitchell has an interesting point.
This is
What is it?
Michael.
Michael.
Hostetler.
Oh, Michael. Sorry.
Yeah.
Michael.
Michael says, I predict the more happy people are, the less materialistic people will be to try to find that happiness. Like having 50 pairs of shoes at one time. Maybe another unintended benefit of basic income. Yeah. I think that's true. I think, if people are less kind of bogged down in meaningless drudgery, there might be less retail therapy, right? Like buying things to make yourself feel better, to recuperate from the fact that you had to work at this job, that kind of thing. And I wouldn't say that's an unintended benefit of basic income. I would say that's something we'd probably see.
Cool.
Yeah.
Should we?
More Douglas Rushkoff.
I want to get through the video because we almost.
We'll get through it.
What about actual participation? What if the workers owned the means of production?
Oh,
See,
Marx.
Yeah, I know, right? But they don't. Again, it's the same thing as universal basic assets. Like people don't care about managing the means of production. What matters is the means of consumption. Basic income gives people money, which is the means of consumption, and that's how they get the benefit. They could use that money to own means of production if they want to buy means of production. But starting there is the wrong way to think about it. And I think it comes back to this whole thinking about people as producers and workers and valuing them based on what they contribute and what they own, instead of valuing them as people and saying, well, how do we get the most benefit to the people? Yeah. All right. Go on.
you don't just give them a handout. So
Yes,
that
you do.
the money ends up in the same corporate
Yeah,
coffers
exactly.
and going into the
That's
same
exactly
shares.
what you do.
Is
That's
that going
not
to
the
say
point.
what? I could,
What-
Sorry.
can't hear what he's saying. What,
Uh,
over you.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, I'll pause.
You've
pause
been
this time.
arguing with him before you got
Ends
here.
up in the same corporate coffers and going into the same shares. That's not the
Okay.
So the same corporate coffers, the money ends up in the same corporate coffers and then gets distributed as
Yeah.
profit to the shareholders,
Right.
right? Like,
But you
yeah,
have a good point. People could buy stocks and stuff if they had a basic income.
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. But why are you putting the stocks in their hands in the first place? Like Richard said, they might just sell their stocks, and if you're giving them stocks instead of money, that's not optimal. They might not sell it, in a smart way that gets them the most benefit, that kind of thing. So I really think money is the most flexible thing, and then people can
I think
decide.
what he's trying to deal with here is the issue of like more and more power accumulating in the hands of fewer people. Like I do think that's what he's trying to do. He's not just
With the
trying to be an
asset
idiot about it.
argument.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
That's why with social wealth fund, you're not allowed to sell your stock or whatever.
Right. So then that brings up the question: if you own it but you're not allowed to sell it, why not just give people the income instead, right? So yeah, I mean, I think he is worried about the accumulation of power, but the accumulation of money is not the same thing as the accumulation of power. There's not a one-to-one correspondence. $1 is worth 1 unit of power. If people have money from a basic income, that's a lot of power. If Uber is accumulating more and more money, or the shareholders of Uber are accumulating more and more money, that is not very much marginal additional political power. Yeah, they're super rich and they have a lot of influence. You double the amount of money they have, it doesn't double the amount of influence they have. They're still super rich.
I worry about that with
I'm not
like
sure.
political campaign donations and stuff. I worry like how much people each of those people is worth in terms of actual dollars.
I mean, there are limits on campaign donations. You can't just put $1 billion into a campaign, right?
Yes, there is. There's dark money.
Well, there's
dark
dark money. Yeah, I mean, like, and
People
I
get
agree.
wild
I
with
agree
this
with you
stuff.
that we need to regulate this kind of stuff. But I also, like, if you just imagine someone having no political power and then some political power, that's a much bigger difference.
I'm with you that like
Yeah.
the benefits outweigh the costs, but I just
Yeah.
don't dismiss this like issue.
Oh,
as
we
much.
should absolutely be regulating campaign contributions more, regulating dark money more. That's
And there's
stuff
some
we should
things that like
absolutely
I don't
do.
know how to deal with, like the fact that the like Kochs might open a whole bunch of institutes that like
Mhm.
theoretically study certain topics, or like
Mhm.
you know have this program for judges that turns out like leads them to lead more
Talking about law and
conservative.
economics.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
I mean, there's like all these like interesting, complicated ways that if you have a ton of money, you can influence things,
Mhm.
and you can't regulate all of those.
Yeah.
So I do worry about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, let's go back to Mitchell's initial question, which was, so how would you go about changing assets such as the housing given with universal basic assets if you were to move? So I mean, that's exactly the point. Like if you're giving people money, they have flexibility on what kind of assets they want to buy, and that includes houses.
Right.
If you're giving them houses and they need to move somewhere, you want an
Right.
efficient market, you want an efficient housing market and an
Right.
efficient labor market, then that just kind of gums up the works.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Right.
let's keep going. More Douglas Rushkoff.
I guess like one more
Yeah.
point to make on this. Theoretically, if you were really worried about the accumulation of wealth, to your point earlier, you could like keep the basic income simple and like tax that money or something. You wouldn't have to do like universal basic assets as a means of reducing like the
No,
stream.
not at all. If you want, like if you feel like you have a good reason to take money away from rich people or to take assets away from rich people, you can do that completely independently of
Right.
the basic
Just
income.
pointing that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
The point. What universal basic income does, if you look at the whole model, is allows the people who own the lion's share of our world to own more and more of it. We just print more money and more of it goes up to the top.
Oh.
That's
That's what I was talking
Really?
about. Yeah,
What?
that's what
Why
he's
is
thinking.
Oh, that's interesting.
Well, he's not
I mean-
wrong about that.
I mean, it's true
Right.
that it goes everywhere. So
Yeah.
yes, it goes to the top too. But I mean, he's making it seem like that's catastrophic in some way that it was going to
Yeah,
the top.
right.
And I
I'm
think
not sure
maybe
why.
he's not factoring in basic income's effects on the financial markets.
Mm.
So-
Oh yeah, we weren't even talking about that. That's
Yeah,
a good
I mean,
point.
we mentioned it earlier, but if the basic income is high enough, that allows the Fed to tighten. It allows the Fed to raise interest rates. So that means it brings stock prices down. It brings,
Right.
it makes it harder to borrow. There's less borrowing, less credit bubble, that kind of stuff. So then it really aligns the incentives of businesses if they want to profit. It's not about just like raising more money from venture capitalists and building up that way. You actually have to be providing something that directly benefits the consumers.
Right. So
Yeah.
there's 2 points in there I want to highlight. Like
Yeah.
one is that there's an effect we didn't talk about where like in addition to money streaming up in terms of people buying things, you might actually reduce money at the top because like of these credit reductions in the stock market and stuff
Right.
like that. And the second thing is the other point you made, which is like right now the interests of of companies are somewhat aligned with the interest of the rest of us, but not fully, and more
Right.
with people with more money and less for people without money and so on. So like
Right. Yeah. So in terms of the money flowing up so that they can own a larger and larger share, if you imagine that the stock market has adjusted, financial markets have adjusted, and all that stuff, now you're just living in a world with a basic income. Yeah, they're accumulating more and more money, which can be used to buy more and more actual stuff. But most people will hold, if they have excess wealth, they're going to hold that as financial assets, which actually financial assets aren't zero sum, right? Like you can accumulate a pile of cash and sit on it, and that doesn't actually mean less stuff for other people.
right.
Right.
I think it's more like I talked about like are you going to spend
Power.
it on political
Yeah.
influence and other kinds of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he was talking about accumulating more and more of the ownership of,
Yeah, I
of
guess-
production.
I guess I didn't know what he meant by that for
Yeah.
sure.
And the ownership of production, I mean, like I said before, people could buy ownership of certain forms of production if they wanted to with their money. That's fine. But there's no need to if what you're getting is the full benefit of the economy, and you don't want to think about managing assets. Yeah. Okay.
Well, that's the first thing that's given me pause, actually,
This is
about in his argument about the money flowing to the top through a consumer activity. I mean,
that's the way it goes.
that's the way it is going. Yeah, that will
And
go
it,
that
it
way.
needs it also needs to go that way because the businesses, in order to stay in business, in order to have an incentive to stay in business, they have to be able to profit, right, and accumulate
Right,
money. So you would
right.
expect that as those businesses are profiting by providing things that consumers want and need, that they're getting richer and richer.
Yeah,
Otherwise, they
yeah,
wouldn't do it.
yeah.
So this is kind of like what you would expect. You'd expect the money to flow that way.
I think that's a point in his favor, that argument. The rich getting richer. Yeah.
In what sense, though?
In the sense of the appeal of universal basic income.
The appeal?
The appeal to ordinary people like me.
Like they don't want the rich to get richer.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, the
For
question
a lot of
is.
reasons, not
But I
just
guess the
because
question
of
is like
resentment and also power.
Right.
And-
But I guess the question is like, how much do you want to keep poor people poor?
Right. Yep.
In order
that's
to
true.
not have the rich
That's
people
right. It's
get richer.
interesting.
Right.
Yeah, it
There's
is.
that dynamic.
Yeah, it is. It's really
So
interesting.
like, yeah, how much of ordinary people's well-being do you want to sacrifice in
Right.
order to punish the rich?
Right.
Yeah.
Or not punish, but prevent them from consolidating. So
Yeah, I'm
much
not
power.
unhappy
Yeah.
about like wealthy people having money
I don't
in the
care about the
abstract.
money
It's just
part.
the political
It's the
power
power
thing that I
part.
worry
Right.
about.
Yeah.
Oh.
All right. Let's see if we can get to the end here.
Okay.
It's not the way to get long-term equity. Sure, Social Security.
We're not
We're not
for
looking.
that.
I mean, like it depends what you mean by equity, right?
Right.
So there's equality of money, which is not something we're ever going to achieve. But then there's also bringing people more up to the same level of
Like,
freedom and
Yeah.
Quality of
and
life.
Yeah, that's
empowerment
true.
and
Yeah.
being able to participate
Right.
and quality of life
Yeah.
and that kind
Yeah.
of thing.
And it's already been shown
Yeah.
like money has diminishing returns for things
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
quality of
yeah,
life.
yeah,
So like
yeah.
you would definitely be bringing people
Right.
closer on those
Yeah.
important dimensions.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Which I think is like really important.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Often when we talk about inequality, we're so focused on income inequality and
Yeah.
wealth inequality
Right.
that when like what really matters for people is like social
Mm-hmm.
inequality, being seen as a full person and being able to participate in
Yeah.
everything that everyone
Yeah,
else
and not
is
having to be like
participating in.
super stressed about money.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
Like at there's a experiment called the baby's first years. I sent you a number of articles about that, where if the parents they give money to parents with newborn children, and they monitor them for the first 3 years. And so if they have more mental bandwidth because they don't have to worry about money, they're able to like talk more to their children.
Be
And
better
if their
parents.
children
Right.
hear more words, they're
Yeah.
able to perform better in
Mhm.
Right.
school and things.
Yeah.
Makes
Makes
sense.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
that kind of thing
Yeah.
is important.
Yeah. So Rick says, if power is a zero-sum game and people get more power with UBI, how do they use that power to increase their well-being? You said corporate power does not increase their wealth. Is that true?
Equal to their wealth.
Corporate power does not increase equal to their wealth. Is that true? Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. What Bethany said about diminishing returns on money, and that's certainly true with power. If someone has no money, and you give them, now they have $12,000 a year or something like that, that's a much greater difference in power for that person than doubling the amount of money that a company has,
Or
something
giving
like
them $12,000 more, which is technically the linear effect.
that. Right, but
Like
we're
have
assuming that
almost
the
no-
money is flowing up to the companies, so
Oh, yeah,
an increase
yeah.
in basic income is
Totally.
vastly more of an increase in
Right,
the income of companies and rich people and stuff like that. So I guess the question is, how do they use that power to increase their well-being? Well, now they have money, so they have negotiating power. They can spend their time how they choose. They can say no to jobs that they don't want to that they don't want to take.
Like treat them poorly.
that-
Yeah, I
that
mean,
might
like
treat them
having
poorly.
to have a job to eat is like a very disempowering
Yeah.
position. I guess.
And if they say no to a job, and they have more money than they had before, that's a direct way to increase their well-being, is by spending on things that make their lives better. And it doesn't have to be things that are wasteful or anything like that. It can be things that are beneficial to them and that are compatible with efficient use of resources. So, when people have more money, that increases their well-being in a lot of ways. And the effect is greatest for the people who have the least amount of starting money. Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
More Douglas Rushkoff.
Security,
Finishing it up.
welfare, the dole, all those things are fine for those in need, but it's not a great long-term economic strategy. It's really just a Band-Aid on extractive corporate capitalism. How do we get to
Where's
extract
Jared? He would have loved
more?
Yeah.
We'll just print more cash for us to extract.
Extractive Capital, what did you say?
Extractive corporate capitalism.
What does
So
that
the
mean?
corporations extract the labor from the people in
Oh.
order to profit.
Or I was
is the
thinking he was
idea.
talking more about natural resources.
Or natural resources,
Oh.
yeah.
That's what he wanted us to use.
I think he's talking about both,
Maybe
probably,
talking about
with
both,
extractive.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's got a very socialist tilt. His whole
Yeah.
take on it.
That's why I was
Yeah.
curious, like, what exactly he had in mind,
And-
or if he
Yeah.
had like specific
Some-
policies.
Right,
or-
yeah.
Something
It wasn't
interesting-
totally
You were
clear.
talking about.
Yeah, it wasn't totally clear what he was
Yeah,
talking about.
and something interesting in that last clip is how he's comparing basic income to welfare programs.
Yeah.
So I think he's
right.
very much putting basic income in that category.
Yeah. I
Rather
agree.
than asking the question, how do we get money into the hands of consumers to make the economy function properly and
Right.
to maximize people's benefit?
Right.
He's thinking about how do you take care of people who are failing to make it in the economy.
Right.
So that makes it
Right.
kind of add up when
Yeah.
he says, when he believed that UBI was a way to help people who are failing to thrive in the economy, and then Uber is using that as an excuse to make it so that more people are naturally failing to thrive in the economy,
Right.
then that can feel offensive, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So I can kind of understand his perspective from that point of
Right.
view. But that's because he's thinking of basic income as a welfare program
Right. Yep.
rather than as kind of fundamental economic infrastructure.
Right. Yeah.
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 Final thoughts? Or actually, we're at the end. Nobody gets any final. Unless
Nobody
anyone
has
has
any
something they
thoughts.
want to say,
No final
we're at
thoughts.
the end.
Really?
So thanks everybody on the
Thank
live
you
stream
guys.
for your great
Very
questions.
active live streams. Good.
I'm glad we made it through the full video.
Yeah.
Next week we're back on Wednesday, and we're going to be talking about red tape, bureaucratic inefficiency.
Ooh.
So yeah,
Something we all love.
something we
Yeah.
all love to talk about.
We're all just like,
Yeah.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Bureaucratic.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank
Great.
you, Alex.
Let me see if I can channel DAC. Oh, here we go.
Oh, I see.
So I have a quick question